At a basic level, Spider-Man 2 essentially has two visual modes, which have a few modifiers to suit a variety of tastes. There's a performance mode, which targets higher frame rates at a reduced quality level, and a fidelity mode, which offers better visuals at a lower frame rate. Both modes have ray traced reflections enabled, so there's no performance mode without RT this time. In terms of underlying visual settings, the two modes look very similar at a glance. Both options provide the same essential visual experience outside of image quality. If we do look a bit closer though, there are some very clearly evident differences between the two. The ray-traced reflections were the first place that I thought to examine. In the performance mode, these are somewhat less detailed than in the fidelity mode, as you might expect. Both modes use a checkerboard reconstruction solution, and both appear perfectly reasonable. But the performance mode is clearly lacking that extra bit of clarity that the fidelity mode offers, at least in stills. I also noticed some substantial differences in reflections coverage between the two modes. Examining the opening cutscene, this gas tank lacks RT reflections in the performance mode, with a lower fidelity cube map seemingly used instead. The transparent surface reflections on the clock face, cabinets, and terrarium are totally missing, which makes for a pretty stark difference here. The metals on the door handle and kick plate also lack RT coverage in the performance mode. We can spot the absence of RT effects on the beaker in the back too, and on the blue lockers outside the classroom. In gameplay, I was able to spot similar cutbacks. In this trophy cabinet, for instance, the fidelity mode gets RT reflections on the transparent glass surface, as well as the semi-gloss trophies themselves. The performance mode predictably lacks these reflections completely. Likewise for the top of the lamppost here, and for a variety of other metallic surfaces throughout the game. I also noticed that the performance mode eschews RT reflections on very distant surfaces, like these buildings here, though this is particularly hard to notice outside of a head-to-head. Perhaps the most obvious cutback in gameplay is the lack of transparency reflections on car windows. In the performance mode, car windows get a cube map reflection that looks okay, but is visibly low resolution. There's no reflections of cars, Spider-Man, or pedestrians. In fidelity mode, the RT extends across the entire car body, so the car windows showcase accurate and detailed reflections, just like the car paint. When flying through the world, there's not much difference between the two modes, but up close the reflections coverage in fidelity mode is clearly a step ahead. My basic impression is that the performance mode drops many of the game's transparency reflections, and cuts back reflections on a range of surface materials. If you compare the two versions side by side, there are some notable differences, but I think in general play the performance mode looks perfectly reasonable. Critically, you do retain the game's reflections on building windows, water surfaces, and most glossy opaque surfaces in the performance mode, which make up the bulk of Spider-Man 2's ray tracing on screen. Foliage also sees some tweaks to run at a performant level at higher frame rates. If you do look closely, the foliage in performance mode is a bit less dense at far distances, with a bit more pop-in as you approach. Grass is drawn much further afield in the fidelity mode as well. Pedestrian activity is also curtailed in the performance mode. For idle pedestrians, like the people sitting at tables and on the stands here in Times Square, there's essentially no difference in pedestrian density. But when you observe a busy thoroughfare like this pedestrian street, there's a clear increase in civilian density in the fidelity mode. At a distance, both modes transition from 3D models to 2D imposters at about the same point from the camera, however. Shadow quality is also somewhat better in the fidelity mode, with a somewhat higher resolution appearance across the game world. These shadows look a bit softer in the performance mode and appear less defined, though they still look perfectly good across both visual options. Finally, character hair does seem to be simplified a bit in the performance mode, with fewer hair strands and a less refined appearance than we see in the fidelity mode. So what about image quality? Spider-Man 2 presents a pretty detailed and smooth image, especially considering the high level of visual quality on display. The performance mode does suffer from more aliasing on fine details than the fidelity option, which is especially evident on these buildings here, and it looks subtly less detailed. In terms of resolution, the performance mode operates from a range of 1008p to 1440p, reconstructed using Insomniac Games' temporal injection technique to 1440p. And the fidelity mode operates from 1440p to 4K, reconstructed to 4K. Both modes look good on a 4K display, but the Fidelity mode clearly has an edge, which is particularly obvious with long-range detail. The performance mode doesn't always resolve very cleanly, though I think it still looks perfectly reasonable from a normal viewing distance. So those are the baseline visual modes, but the game has two key modifiers as well. You can turn on 120Hz output, which makes the Fidelity mode run at 40 FPS, lowering the typical resolution down closer to that 1440p lower bound. VRR is also an option. The default smooth option doesn't seem to affect the visuals, but selecting the uncapped option can adjust the resolution a bit. The performance mode can drop down to 936p at lowest with this option enabled, down from 1008p normally.